Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7. My name is Brian Liddy. Before I introduce this evening's guest, I'm just going to read today's Ukraine update, which is day 211. And then once we've done that, then we'll get started with today's stories, and I'll introduce you to our guest for this evening. So, Ukraine update 211. Security forces detained more than 1,300 people in Russia overnight at protests denouncing mobilization, a rights group said hours after President Vladimir Putin ordered Russia's first military draft since the Second World War. The Moscow Times is carrying a report that a Russian military recruitment office and an administration building were attacked overnight in two separate locations during the anti-mobilization protests. The Kremlin has dismissed reports of an exodus of Russian men of fighting age following Vladimir Putin's announcement of a partial mobilization as exaggerated. The UK Ministry of Defence has described the mobilisation as an admission that Russia has exhausted its supply of willing volunteers to fight in Ukraine. It said Russia is likely to struggle with the logistical and administrative challenges of even mustering the 300,000 personnel. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, speaking at the UN Security Council meeting today, said talk of a nuclear conflict was totally unacceptable. Any annexation of a state's territory by another state through the threat or use of force is a violation of the UN Charter and international law, he continued. President Zelensky thanked Turkey and Saudi Arabia for their roles in the prisoner exchanges, which included 5 UK citizens and 5 international prisoners after the intervention of Saudi Arabia. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said the prisoner swap carried out by Russia and Ukraine, involving almost 300 people and mediated by Turkey, was an important step towards ending the war. General Staff of the Ukraine Army has issued updated figures of the losses it claims to have inflicted on Russia and pro-Russia forces within occupied areas of Ukraine, raising it to 55,510. North Korea has denied it is providing arms to Russia, state media said weeks after. I'll read that again. North Korea has denied it is providing arms to Russia, state media said, weeks after the US said Moscow was turning to Pyongyang to replenish its stocks depleted by invading Ukraine. Poland has distributed iodine tablets to regional fire departments to give people in the event of radioactive exposure Again, I think I'll go back, forgive me. Poland has distributed iodine tablets to regional fire departments to give people in the event of radioactive exposure after concerns about fighting around Ukraine's, I think we're missing a word there, to give people protection in the event of radioactive exposure after concerns about fighting around Ukraine's Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Uzbekistan's state prosecutors warned citizens against joining foreign armies after Russia offered fast-track citizens to those whose citizenship to those who sign up, and Ukraine said it had captured Uzbeks fighting alongside Russians. The head of the UN nuclear watchdog agency said Wednesday he met with Ukraine's and Russia's foreign ministers in a bid to establish a safety and security zone around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. So I'm joined this evening by Maureen Watt. Good evening, Maureen. How are you?
Good evening, Brian. Yes, I'm fine, thank you.
So,
I'm coming to you from London tonight, and can maybe hear a railway line in the background, so apologies for that. Can't do anything about it.
not at all. I'm sure it'll be fine. Maybe the people passing by in the trains, they can listen in on what we're having to say tonight. So, Maureen, you've been a regular contributor to Broadcasting Scotland, so for that we thank you. And you were an MSP for Aberdeen South and North Kincardine from 2011 to 2021. Is that right? Yeah.
That's correct, yes, I retired. at the election last May.
Shows support in Scotland for Scottish independence has increased in recent years, with 52% of people in Scotland favouring independence when asked to choose between independence, devolution, and no Scottish Parliament. This is up from 23% in 2012. Commenting, SNP Deputy Leader Keith Brown said, "This is the highest ever support for independence in this series of authoritative surveys." Mr Brown went on to say, "Because of Westminster control over Scotland, we are subject to a Tory party moving ever more to the right, apparently planning to scrap the cap on bankers' bonuses, while the vast majority of people take a hit to their living standards because of Brexit." He went on to say, "Independent European countries similar to Scotland are wealthier and fairer than the UK, so why not Scotland?" So, Maureen, let me just get my notes straight. This news comes at the same time we learn that there are more Catholics, and Catholics now outnumber Protestants in Northern Ireland for the first time, as a poll has shown today. So combined with that, the news about Scottish independence, do you think attitudes towards Brexit are now intertwined with attitudes towards the Union?
Well, it would appear that that may well be the case. I mean, Northern Ireland and Scotland voted obviously against Brexit. Northern Ireland is possibly it is more to the fore in Northern Ireland. I don't know exactly when John Curtis did his attitude survey. Normally, they're over a period of time, so it's very interesting on both counts. I think, for as well as the increase in the number of Catholics in Northern Ireland, there was part of the statistics showed that there are about the same number of people in favour who call themselves British as call themselves Irish, and then about 26% call themselves Northern Irish. So it'll be interesting to see if and whenever the assembly in Northern Ireland gets back up and running, just how politics will evolve there. But I think it's very encouraging that such a well-respected survey is showing an increase in support for independence. I suspect that if we looked at delved into the figures, we would see that younger people, as has always been the case, are more interested in supporting independence than older folks. So that bodes well. Although hopefully we don't have to wait for the next attitude survey. I think they come are they every 10 years or something, to get it above 52. Oh, I'm prepared to go and campaign on with a basic support of 52%, because we saw at the last referendum how we increased support during the campaign so much that we it was so close.
Yeah, that's an interesting point you make about young people being more in support of independence. I'm not sure if 16 and 17-year-olds were included in this survey, but we could maybe do a bit of digging and find out. But just quickly before we move on, have you any idea? I mean, it's great that it's up from 23% in 2012, but have you any idea why it's kind of stuck in the sort of bottom end of the 50s? Any thoughts on that?
Yes, I think from what I hear from people, it's just kind of fear of the unknown. I think, I heard of one couple, youngish in the 30s couple, who were worried because they had a mortgage, and whereas they thought the long term independence would be very good for Scotland, they were kind of worried about the upheaval that there might be just post the the referendum result and moving towards independence. I think people are still worried about economic matters and just things about bank rates and all that kind of stuff. So I think the pro independence groups and the Scottish government have a lot of work to do in terms of reassuring people that it is possible to do this, and that at the end of the tunnel there is light in terms of Scotland being able to make a great success of being independent.
Okay. Thank you, Maureen. So the next story is Constitution Secretary Angus Robertson has warned that environment, food and animal welfare standards are amongst thousands of laws now at risk because of the UK government's retained EU law, or the Revocation and Reform Bill. The retained EU law, the retained EU law bill published today in the House of Commons seeks to revoke over 2,400 pieces of EU legislation that were included in the UK statute book at the end of the Brexit transition period. In a letter to new Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, Jacob Rees-Mogg, Mr Robertson wrote of his deep concern at the wholesale sunsetting of retained EU law by the 31st of December 2023, warning it carries an unacceptably high risk that vital law on which the smooth functioning of sectors of the economy and society depends simply drops off the UK statute book. The introduction of the retained EU law bill risks removing restrictions on the use of decontaminants on meat, such as the chlorine washes on chicken, and businesses' minimum hygiene standards. It could also jeopardise protections in relation to the safety and compositional standards of baby food. Holiday pay, safe limits on working hours and parental leave could also become open to deregulation. The letter also warns that the bill represents a significant further undermining of devolution by allowing UK government ministers to act in policy areas that are devolved, and to do so without the consent of Scottish ministers or the Scottish Parliament. Scottish ministers are committed to aligning regulations in Scotland with EU regulations. Mr Robertson pressed the UK government to consider the bill and its implications for the devolved governments. So, Maureen, this is the bonfire of red tape that the Vote Leave crew promised during the campaign for Brexit before the Brexit referendum. So it seems they're delivering on that promise, but it turns out that a lot of that red tape protected citizens' rights and environmental rights. So is it a bonfire of workers' rights and a bonfire of environmental standards rather than red tape?
Well, of course, businesses would call that red tape. But, as a former HR professional, these rights have been hard fought for and hard won throughout my lifetime, really. And I think people will be horrified if they think things like parental leave uh, and maternity leave. And that you didn't mention the working time directive, Brian. I think that's included it as well. And this idea that if people work long hours, they're more productive, I think has been soundly discredited. And that if people work shorter hours, they tend to be more productive during that shorter working time. So it is really going back, in my view, in terms of um, employment law and health and safety law back into the dark ages. And I think people will be horrified that things are going backwards instead of forwards in terms of good working relations. And I can see it. We're thinking that there might be a winter of discontent because of the high inflation. But with this on top of it, I don't know what the government are storing up for themselves.
Thanks, Maureen. That actually leads quite nicely into our next story. So you might be able to sort of unpack that your thoughts there a little bit more. With this story about the Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng, is planning to implement changes to universal credit, which will force around 120,000 claimants who work part-time to increase their hours or face sanctions. In his mini-budget tomorrow, the Chancellor will announce changes to universal credit, which will require benefit claimants working up to 15 hours a week at national living wage to meet regularly with their work coach and take active steps to increase their earnings or face having their benefits reduced. The change increases in the threshold from 12 to 15 hours and is aimed at bringing an additional 120,000 benefit claimants into the intensive work search regime. That's all capitalised, by the way, the intensive work search regime. The Chancellor said rising economic inactivity in the over 50s is contributing to shortages in the job market, driving up inflation and limiting growth. Ahead of the mini budget tomorrow, the Bank of England has said that the UK economy is now in recession as it raised interest rates by 0.5 percentage points to 2.25%. The Monetary Policy Committee was split, three members voting for a 0.75% increase. However, the majority of the Monetary Policy Committee, including the bank's governor, Andrew Bailey, voted for a half-point increase, while the rate-setting panel's new external economist, Swati Dhingra, pushed for a smaller quarter-point rise in reflection of concern over the deteriorating strength of the economy. So, Maureen, when I read this story, it took my mind back to a book called Britannia Unchained, which was a joint effort by Kwasi Kwarteng, the now Chancellor, Priti Patel, Dominic Raab, and our own Prime Minister Truss. A couple of the quotes from that book said, one was that said that too many people in the UK prefer to lie in rather than do hard work. And my own personal favourite, British are among the worst idlers in the world. So I don't know. I suppose have have they always been honest then in what they think about British workers?
Well, these are extremely trite comments from that book, not backed up at all. I mean, if you're talking about productivity, productivity is quite low in the UK, but often we are told it's because of poor infrastructure and lack of private investment in companies to bring machinery and that kind of stuff up to date. But when I read this, I just thought, I'm head in my hands stuff, because I think over the past few years, especially in Scotland, we have done an awful lot to try and get people who would have been quite far from the labour market into the labour market gradually, by having, shorter working time, working part time. If people have learning difficulties, perhaps on the autistic spectrum, or mental health problems, working full time, and if a working time directive comes in, longer hours than ever before, they're simply going to drop out of the labour market altogether, and that we're going to have the problems that we were trying to get them over right back there again. So it is totally, in my view, counter productive, and to have people who find things difficult anyway, but have benefited from a few hours work a day. It's given them some self-esteem back. We're just going to take that away from people again. And so, as well as those people, a lot of people work part-time because of caring commitments, whether it be parents of young children or people with elderly parents that they're looking after. People make the best choices for themselves and their families, and for the state to intervene on telling people how many hours they should work is just so awful. It doesn't bear thinking about. It's just, I seem to say that every time I'm on this program, but things are getting so much worse that I just despair. And the results, my view is that the results of what they're proposing will be counterproductive. They won't have more people in the labour market, but they'll have fewer people.
I'm sorry that we make you feel despair when you come on Broadcasting Scotland, but I promise we don't do it on purpose.
No, I didn't mean it as you particular, but the
No,
stories we're covering.
I must admit, I share that feeling. Let's move on to the next story. The SNP's shadow chancellor has urged the UK government to adopt the real living wage after it rose today by a record 10% to £10.90 an hour in Scotland in response to the cost of living crisis. Campaigning, MP Alison Thewlis called for urgency from the UK government, claiming the largest year-on-year rise of the real living wage reflected the Tories' poor handling of the spiralling cost of living crisis. The real living wage, separate from the UK government's national living wage and higher by £1.40 an hour, is calculated independently by the Living Wage Foundation charity to reflect the rising cost of living in the UK. Figures reveal that a worker earning the wage would make nearly £3,000 more a year than those on the government national living wage, which is only available to workers over the age of 23. Ms. Thewlis criticised the UK government's consistent refusal over a decade to implement the real living wage and praised the efforts made by the Scottish government to sign organisations up to the scheme. The Scottish Government is an accredited living wage employer and has continued to encourage organisations to pay the real living wage through the Fair Work Action Plan. According to Living Wage Scotland, 2,800 employers in Scotland have living wage accreditation, giving 57,000 Scottish workers a pay rise as a result. Commenting, Alison Thewlis said, "The fact that this is the highest year-on-year increase to the real living wage since its inception in 2011 speaks to the spiralling cost of living crisis millions are having to endure under the Tories at Westminster, and shows a real living wage for all is more important than ever. It also proves yet again that the UK government's national living wage is just a cynical rebrand of the minimum wage, with no thought or care put in to ensure workers are properly paid or equipped to deal with the financial troubles they face today." She went on to say, "The situation the UK government has created, where many households are forced to choose between whether to heat or eat, could be massively alleviated if they used their powers to ensure workers are paid a decent and dignified livable wage. It is only the Westminster government that has the power to bring in a real living wage and provide a decent standard of living to millions." So, Maureen, when I read this story, my mind first went to a list of achievements by the current Scottish government, including things like the Scottish Child Payment and 12 new social security benefits that they've introduced. I'm also thinking that the SNP Green government at the moment, they recently announced a little while back a package to help with the cost of living crisis from their fixed budget. And I remember being worried that whatever money they raised to tackle or to provide that package to alleviate the cost of living crisis, they would have to take that money away from something that they'd already agreed in their manifesto. And I'm worried about what we would lose having to mitigate the cost of living crisis. I don't know, some things promised. I don't know. What do you, I'll be quiet and let you answer. What do you think?
Um, well, like you, Brian, I'm always amazed at how, um, with a fixed budget, the Scottish government manages to do so much. But at the same time, it's so annoying that we could be doing other more innovative things if we didn't have to mitigate the worst excesses of the Tory government and Westminster. And that's what we seem to be increasingly have to do, and biting into more and more of the things that we'd rather do if the Westminster government was doing the job that it should be. Um, the Scottish real living wage has been a real success, and in this day and age, with as you say, Brian, with inflation and rises in the cost of living, etc., we should surely be moving upwards continually and faster to a living wage of about £15 an hour. I know some of the trade unions, if not all of them, are calling for that. But at the moment, the Scottish Real Living Wage provides a basis on which, well, hopefully that no one falls under that. And there's still room for more and more employers in Scotland to sign up to that. And I think it does these firms that do sign up a lot. It shows that they care about what their workers are earning, and puts them in a good light, perhaps in relation to those others that don't. But the pressures on the Scottish government, for example, with its fixed budget, to continually try and increase, especially the lowest paid, is a continual worry. I mean, I always said to John Swinney, I couldn't do your job because I'd be lying awake all night, or maybe burrowing under the sofa to see if there were other piles and pots of money. But these must be running out totally. I don't know if I didn't say the same to Kate Forbes, but she's got other things on her mind at the moment with her little baby. But yeah, the pressures on the Scottish Government budget are huge, and I just wish we had control of all the levers with independence, that we could be making better choices and the best choices for the vast majority of the population.
Thank you, Maureen. And I think this story and some of the things that you said actually chimes with some of the stories that we've got coming up a little bit later on. It's like they all seem to be interconnected at the moment. So the next story is the 1.25 percentage point rise in national insurance will be reversed from the 6th of November, Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng has announced today ahead of his mini budget tomorrow. Prime Minister Liz Truss had said she would cut taxes and cancel the national insurance rise during her Conservative Party leadership campaign. The government will also cancel the planned health and social care levy, a separate tax which was coming into force in April 2023 to replace this year's national insurance rise. The levy was expected to raise around £13 billion a year to fund health and social care in England and Wales. Critics of the government have said that cutting taxes only benefits the rich and have criticised the UK government's return to trickle-down economics. So this is one of those stories, Maureen, that I was thinking chimes with the previous story. Liz Truss is right, isn't she? I mean, we do need growth and higher wages, but are tax cuts at this time the way to do it? And I'll just slip in there. I mean, I thought that the Tories were supposed to hate borrowing. If you think about austerity and what we went through to kind of, so that we didn't have to borrow. So what's going on? Why such high borrowing figures now?
I wonder that too. I mean, if you don't raise taxes to cover your outgoings, then you've got to borrow. And I've read a few things over the last few days to say that borrowing is at the level that this current government is doing is really stoking up problems, especially with interest rate rises. And, if you borrow, you've still got to pay the increased rates of interest at which you are borrowing. So, where this is going to end in a couple of years, perhaps prior to the next general election, is really interesting because you cannot cut taxes and expect growth, which economists predict is it's not certain that cutting these taxes is going to give the required growth that would be needed to offset these taxes with more people paying more money through income tax. So I'm with the health service, under pressure before COVID, exacerbated by COVID, and now going into the winter to cut the tax, the health and cares levy, um, which they said was necessary a few months ago, just seems to me to be reckless. Yes, I'd say it's reckless because it doesn't seem to me that they've thought through and listened to various economists. I know they don't agree on anything, but listen to what the results might be. And, as always, I just really worry about the future. And as you say, the rich will be okay, but it's the people on lower incomes that will be hardest hit. And there's nothing that has over the years suggested that trickle down economics works. So why we're not taking a different path in the UK, I don't know.
Yes, and trickle down economics, I tend to think of it also known as pouring up economics. It seems that money is going up in the wrong direction, if you ask me. Just very quickly, I've got a list of things that are planned by the current Westminster government, and all of them are going to cost money. So they plan to reverse the national insurance tax rise, as we heard in the story there. They plan to cancel an increase in corporation tax. There's possibly going to be a stamp duty reduction on buying houses. There's a possible income tax cut to come. They're going to abolish bankers' bonus tax, and they're going to increase spending on defence, including money going to Ukraine. As I said, all this costs money, and this is at a time of rising inflation when it costs more for governments to pay for the national debt, and it costs more for governments to borrow. And Labour are now starting to talk about the magic money tree. But anyway, that's just a little bonus. I suppose we'd better move on if that's okay.
Yeah, well, it'll be interesting to see what this mini budget statement will say tomorrow, and whether it'll again be reinforcing all these giveaways, but not giving us the other side of the balance sheet to see where it's all coming. So, yes, it'll be interesting, I'm sure, over the weekend, and we'll be discussing that further on Broadcasting Scotland.
I'm sure we will. And as you say, looking forward to the headlines tomorrow. So the next story is a Scottish Parliament committee has found that the Sewell Convention, the protocol by which the UK government respects devolved competence and does not seek to override Holyrood, is at risk of collapsing altogether as a result of UK ministers undermining devolution post-Brexit. The Constitution, Europe, External Affairs and Culture Committee concluded in a report that Brexit has put the devolution settlement under serious strain as the Sewell Convention and legislative consent have been disregarded. Committee members also found that UK ministers had adopted new delegated powers that amounts to a significant constitutional change. The committee concluded that its findings posed a serious threat to devolution. Commenting, SNP MSP Jenny Minto said, "The threat posed to the future of the Scottish Parliament by the UK Tory government is real and has already started with numerous power grabs, including the Internal Market Bill and a Levelling Up Fund, both of which take powers from Holyrood. Brexit has not only posed a serious threat to the future of businesses and industries across Scotland, but also to the democratically elected Scottish Parliament. UK ministers are showing sheer contempt for our Scottish Parliament when they legislate in devolved areas," she said. So, Maureen, Boris Johnson, a little while back, reminded us that haggis is banned in the USA and that Brexit would be an opportunity to reverse that situation. And yet, there is no new trade deal on the horizon between the UK and America. And I'm realising that maybe I've kind of missed the point of this story. I think I just saw Brexit and went down a Brexit tunnel again. But so again, I think I'll just hand over to you to make some sense of this.
Um, well, on the point that you made about Brexit would mean we'd be able to strike deals with other countries, and particularly the big market of the US. And we find this week under Liz Truss that is even further away than we thought. I mean, we thought it was further away by Obama, who said would be at the bottom of the list, and Joe Biden didn't. Like us particularly because of the Northern Ireland Protocol. And now it seems, oh, we're not getting it, so it doesn't really matter. But if we're not finding markets to replace the EU market, then that doesn't bode well for our industries, and particularly in Scotland, our excellent food and drink exports, which have been increasing exponentially until we hit the Brexit barrier. But to come back to the protocols in terms of the devolution settlement and the Sewell Convention, even prior to Liz Truss, who has chosen, as we know, to say that she's just going to ignore Nicola Sturgeon and by implication ignore the Scottish government, we're going to get more of the Westminster government running roughshod over the devolved governments. And I read an article from saying that Mark Drake Bedford, and all the previous prime ministers that he's had, they phoned him on day one, and he's still waiting for the call from Liz Truss. So this is something that, in the run up to the independence referendum, that the Scottish government and all the Yes organisations are going to have to press really hard, because devolution has been a success. I know the unionists will say it hasn't, but it has been a success. We've been able to do things differently, and give and make laws and policies relating in particular to Scotland's needs. And it's really important that people try and remember what it was like prior to devolution, where Scotland was perhaps mentioned and bills relating to Scotland might be discussed about 3 times a year. So it really is important that we realise what the benefits of independence for Scotland will be, and that Scotland can make its own laws relating to its own needs.
Yes, so for myself, I'm going to make a note to self, Brian, pay more attention and when you're preparing for broadcasting Scotland. But I think maybe I should have. It would have been interesting to maybe look at the Smith Commission and see how that maybe would have could have influenced what our discussion. But I'll move on to the next story. I'll draw a veil over that mistake that I made there. So in Indiana today, a judge has blocked enforcement of the state's week-old abortion ban, putting the new law on hold as Planned Parenthood and other clinic operators argue it violates the state constitution. The Owen County Judge Kelsey Hanlon issued a preliminary injunction against the ban that took effect a week ago. The injunction was sought by clinic operators who argued the state constitution protects abortion access. The ban was approved by Indiana's Republican-held state legislature on 5th of August and was signed by the Republican governor, Eric Holcomb. It made Indiana the first state to enact tighter abortion restrictions since the US Supreme Court eliminated federal protections by overturning Roe v. Wade in June. The judge wrote, "There is reasonable likelihood that this significant restriction of personal autonomy offends the liberty guarantees of the Indiana Constitution." Judge Hanlon also said the clinics would prevail in the lawsuit. The order prevents the state from enforcing the ban pending trial. The state attorney general and Republican leaders did not immediately comment. The ban, which has only limited exceptions, replaced laws that generally prohibited abortions after the 20th week of pregnancy and tightly restricted them after the 13th week. The American Civil Liberties Union of Indiana filed a lawsuit on 31st of August, arguing the ban would prohibit the overwhelming majority of abortions in Indiana and, as such, will have a devastating and irreparable impact on the plaintiffs and, more importantly, their patients and clients. The ban includes exceptions allowing abortions in cases of rape and incest, only up to 10 weeks post-fertilization, to protect the life and physical health of the mother and if a fetus is diagnosed with a lethal anomaly. The law also prohibited abortion clinics from providing any abortion care, leaving such services to be provided solely by hospitals or outpatient surgical centres owned by hospitals. So, Maureen, this is quite a grim reading that we have again for you this evening. I'm sorry. And as a man, I really don't feel qualified to even formulate a question. So I'm just going to ask, can I ask what your thoughts are on this story?
Well, I just think it highlights how even post Trump, the effects of the Trump government has had in the United States, and his ability to load the Supreme Court with ultra right anti abortion judges. And now we're seeing the effects of that, with, as you said, the the federal rights being eroded in terms of abortion, and each state making its own laws on this. It's interesting that one of the states, I can't remember which one, where they had a referendum on the issue, they voted to maintain the woman's right to have an abortion. So, where the people are consulted, rather than the state legislatures making up their own mind on behalf of women, which shows you just how important it is to have a balance in all aspects of our life in terms of men and women on legislatures. Um, but yes, it's the fault lines in the states continue, and it seems that Trump's influence is going to continue throughout the Biden um, years. But I am hopeful that in many states they will decide to continue with women's rights, and I think that we'll see a lot more demonstrations throughout the United States, um, and not leaving it to men in grey suits in legislatures to decide what's best for women in this day and age. It's barbaric.
Yes, I'm told that the state that had a referendum was Kansas, and we're kind of a little bit tight for time, but can you remember what the result of that referendum was? And do you think there would be more states would take that same route?
I can't remember what it was. The result was, but it was that that abortion should still be available, or women's right to choose should still be available. Nobody wants it, but to do it, but for women, often it is the last resort, and um, men should not be deciding on what women want to do with their bodies, which is why I think states should have the courage to put that sort of thing to a referendum if it's now going to be something that's decided at the state level rather than at the federal level.
Yeah, sobering um, thoughts indeed. So moving on, health boards in Scotland have made significant progress in reducing the number of people waiting more than 2 years for an outpatient appointment. Statistics published today show that by the end of August, 22 out of 41 specialities had no patients waiting longer than 2 years for their treatment, with 9 others having fewer than 10 people still waiting over that time. The national target to clear 2 years' waits in most specialties by the end of August was set in July to address the impact of the pandemic on long waiting times for planned care. Data published by Public Health Scotland shows by the end of August that 22 out of 41 specialties had no patients waiting more than 2 years, that 31 of 41, that's 76%, of outpatient specialties had no or fewer than 10 patients waiting more than 2 years, that 71%, that's 10 out of 14, of territorial health boards had 5 patients or fewer waiting more than 2 years. So a small number of patients were unable to be seen by the end of August target for personal or clinical reasons. The Scottish Government will continue to work closely with the boards where the majority of long waits in some specialties remain to ensure these are cleared as quickly as possible. 90% of the 2 year waits were in either Ayrshire in Arran or Grampian Health Board. Health Secretary Humza Yousaf said, "I would like to thank all NHS staff for their phenomenal work to tackle these long waits. Their efforts will have an overwhelming positive impact on the lives of patients who have had their waits for treatment exacerbated by the pandemic." Um, so, um, let's see, I got.
I think that's very encouraging news. And if you have been in hospital recently, um, it's just you just get this impression that people in outpatients departments are working flat out to get people through. And the opposition parties like to make lots about waiting times, and until you drill down into waiting time to see how many of the appointments were appointments missed by people changing the appointment themselves, people nowadays, having contracting COVID because you need to test before you go. Well, you would test before you go in. So there are a lot of things that contribute to waiting times being long, and it's not just that the whole team to do surgery, for example, is not there. Perhaps some of the team have been uh, brought down again by COVID. So there are all sorts of reasons. But as I say, when you go into the hospital, you get the impression that everybody is trying um, to clear the backlog as quickly as possible. But when you think we had a year and a half, 2 years of COVID, and the backlog that's built up, and the fact that the elective centres that the Scottish Government proposed to make sure that hips, knees, and eyes were not affected by, you know, road accidents and things coming in and using the theatre time that they're split off. The fact that they felt the rollout of those fell behind during COVID, I think, hats off to the NHS who are, even after COVID, where they worked their socks off, are continuing to work really hard to reduce the backlog, and I have just such respect for them all.
Yes, and it's just maybe worth saying that outpatients isn't really considered to be the most glamorous aspect of the NHS, but I think these figures show just how incredibly important outpatients are, and compared to things like brain surgery and heart surgery. So it's people's daily experience, isn't it? But so let's move on to the next story. Councils and registered social landlords will be able to apply for Scottish Government funding to bring properties into use and increase the supply of housing for those fleeing the conflict in Ukraine. Through the Ukraine Longer Term Resettlement Fund, up to £50 million of funding will be made available to refurbish properties that otherwise would not be available for let. The homes provided will be good quality, affordable homes and will be available for rent for up to 3 years, in line with the visa length, after which some will continue to be available as social rented homes. Minister with special responsibility for refugees from the Ukraine, Neil Gray, said, "We are providing sanctuary to more displaced people per head of population than any other part of the UK. Over the past 7 months, more than 18,411 people have arrived into the UK with a sponsor located in Scotland. This exceeds our initial commitment to support and welcome 3,000 people, and we are proud we have been able to provide a place of safety. We don't want people spending any longer than necessary in temporary accommodation, so we are working hard to find longer-term sustainable accommodation." So, Maureen, it seems to me that the key word in that story is sanctuary. And Ukrainians in Scotland, I'm sure, would rather be in their own homes back in Ukraine, but obviously they can't go yet. Meanwhile, Scotland needs to replace its ageing population. Do you think there could be some overlap? And do you think would some people maybe want some Ukrainians want to stay in Scotland once the conflict is over? And also, I'm just thinking that housing in general in Scotland is there's a shortage. So if it seems to be it's all good news. Do you think?
Yes, I mean, the number of empty homes, not just council ones, which required to be upgraded, but ones in the private rented sector, and even the number of homes that are caught up in legal disputes, always really astonished me as an MSP. So there is housing available, and this money, whether it be for council housing or housing associations or the private sector or whatever to upgrade, it is really welcome. I think what we saw with Scotland taking a large number of Syrian refugees, and Aberdeenshire, where I live, was one of those who took quite a lot. We're seeing that they wanted to stay. I think the difference, though, in Ukraine is that a lot of families came without their husbands, who had to stay, um, or the males in the family had to stay to fight the war. So I think there will be a bigger um, desire to go back when it's safe, and that doesn't look as if it's going to happen anytime soon. But even the Ukrainians that you speak to are here. They want to be able to contribute to society as quickly as possible. And there are so many areas of our economy where we could do with them. But I think you need to feel settled for your family in your own house with your own key, um, as well as trying to get work. So I think again, what Scotland and the local authorities are doing in this area makes me proud to be Scottish, and the way the international community sees us in terms of doing that bit for people in more need of ourselves, I think really does resonate with a lot of people internationally.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think my question was maybe a little bit misguided. You're absolutely right. The main thing is that one day these families are reunited. I hadn't really thought about men being left behind while their wives and daughters are here. So yeah, let's hope that there's resolution sometime soon. So our last story of the evening is the Minister for Youth Employment and Training, Jamie Hepburn, has announced an independent review of how skills are delivered in Scotland to ensure the system is fit for purpose. Led by James Withers, former Chief Executive of Scotland Food and Drink, the review will seek to take advantage of emerging opportunities and meet the challenges of economic transformation. It will focus on how to continue the process of better aligning the responsibilities of Skills Development Scotland and the Scottish Funding Council, looking at areas such as the design and delivery of training, apprenticeship programmes, excuse me, regional and sectoral skills planning and employer engagement. Mr Hepburn said, while the foundations of Scotland's post-school education and skills system are strong, we need a skills system that meets the demands of an ever-changing world. That skills system has to be simple, people-focused and built on effective collaboration across sectors and regions, between the public sector and the business and between the public sector and business and across our public bodies. Excuse me. James Withers has a wealth of experience in industry that will bring objectivity, creativity, and rigour to the independent review. Maureen, I'm wondering, does this echo perhaps the kind of investment that the Westminster government should be making instead of tax cuts?
Well, I despair when the Westminster government gets involved in skills training. Um, they imposed a new levy on employers in England, which just had the effect of disrupting what we're doing in Scotland. I mean, as somebody who set up Skills Development Scotland in between 2007 and 2009, when the SNP government first came to power, I'm very proud of what we've done. I mean, we see that Scotland has one of the highest levels of positive destinations for our school leavers, whether it be into higher education, into and further education, into apprenticeships, or directly into work. And I think, pre-COVID, Scotland was the second or third country in Europe with the highest number of apprenticeships after Germany. So I'm not sure what it is post-COVID, but we were doing really well, and a huge number of employers were on board and taking apprentices. I think, and I hope what Jim Withers will do, whom I'm a great fan of James Withers, um, will not only respond to the demands of current employers in terms of the skills needed for people going into work, but also think of the industries that we we could have in Scotland and don't currently have, and what we need in terms of that, so that innovators and entrepreneurs who are willing to set up companies are given uh, a voice in terms of what James Withers comes up with. So I'll be very interested in watching what comes up in this area.
It, it seems like quite a nice counterpoint to the number of students going to university in Scotland. And we're told again that we've got a high percentage of people going into tertiary higher education. But this seems quite well balanced then in that sense. Do you think?
Yes, I mean, didn't we hear recently that Scotland is the highest educated, best educated country in Europe, at least, if not further afield? Um, but I want us to stay as that, because you need brains in order to have the innovation and the discoveries that Scotland has been famous for centuries. And I do not want to see the kind of dumbing down, that the kind of attitude that we get from Westminster, that employees should just be you know, like ants on a production line. And these days are well over, and hopefully never come back. And if that's what England and Westminster wants to, well, we certainly don't. So bring on independence.
Thank you, Maureen. Thank you. I mean, that's almost the end of the show. Well, it is the end of the show, but thank you for your patience with me, and thank you for your continued support, and thank you for giving such quality answers compared to my rather awkward questions. But so anyway, we'll see you again, I hope.
Thank you.
So that's it for this evening. Before I go, I just want to remind you that we at Broadcasting Scotland depend on the generosity of our supporters. So to everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, we thank you very much. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We've set ourselves a target of adding 10,000 new subscribers to enable us to employ staff to make more programmes. Good night, and thank you for watching.